Everybody, it's Charles, your hobby hero, and today we're going to be talking about how Upper Deck is suing Ravensburger and Ryan Miller for the Lorcana card game. But first, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing down the bottom corner. I do appreciate it. I do put out regular content about the hobbies that I love the most, with this channel specifically being focused on Lorcana. Now, you heard me right. Upper Deck is coming out of the gates right before the launch of Lorcana with a massive lawsuit stating that Ryan Miller is in breach of contract and that Ravensburger facilitated that breach of contract and has just thrown the entire community into an absolute whirlwind. I've actually read through the suit a couple of times. Was going to break down some of the stuff that I saw in there and see whether or not Upper Deck has a case at all for this litigation. So basically, on the surface, we have Upper Deck, who hired Ryan Miller back in 2019 for a work-for-hire contract to help launch a TCG for Upper Deck. He's worked on a couple other projects for them. This particular TCG was going to be their next big thing to compete with a lot of the market that's coming out right now. So they really had a big investment into the development of this. Several years went by, and ultimately Ryan ended up leaving the project before it was completed and going to start work for Ravensburger and starting on their project Lorcana. Now, the Ravensburger's claim is that he basically took all the work that he did for Upper Deck and was paid for by Upper Deck, jumped ship, took all that work to Ravensburger, and then was able to launch the identical game over at Ravensburger with a new IP being Lorcana. And one of the things that you have to understand is, first and foremost, that systems and processes that are in these games are not proprietary. They cannot be considered intellectual property. They aren't protected. Now, there are certain aspects of games that can be. If you're familiar with Magic the Gathering, the word tap and the tap symbol are intellectual properties owned by Magic the Gathering. The process of turning a card 90 degrees and adding a resource to your resource pool is something that Magic came up with, but that process cannot be considered intellectual property in Magic, which is why you see that 90-degree turn on cards to show that they've been used, exhausted, whatever that phrasing they want to use for it, is pretty predominant throughout the card game. So that's something to keep in mind, that any of those similarities that the two games share would be completely thrown out the window. Now, what Upper Deck is trying to establish is that something that they created that was new or novel, as the suit will say, and proprietary, which means it hadn't been released yet. The only way it could show up in this Lorcana game was if Ryan Miller breached his non-disclosure contract from Upper Deck and took that information and disclosed it with Lorcana. So you've got to really show some big similarities between the two, and we're going to go through the suit, see what those similarities are, if any, and I'll let you know kind of what my thoughts are throughout it, though I don't think it'll take you very long to figure out which way I lean on this. First and foremost, the thing you need to understand is who Ryan Miller is. He's the co-creator of Lorcana. He started his work for Wizards of the Coast, so he's obviously very familiar with working on projects for Magic the Gathering. He also worked on the Duel Masters card game, the Kaijudo card game, which was based off the Duel Masters card game, and most recently the Digimon card game. And a lot of similarities between those games. Their design, as they came out with Lorcana, they said they weren't trying to reinvent the wheel with this system. I think everybody who had any experience with any of the Ryan Miller games prior to this saw the similarities in this product. So the Lorcana game, as it is right now, is not a huge leap outside of the realm of reason to think that Ryan Miller would have come up with this game without taking proprietary information. However, we're going to see if the two games are similar enough for Upper Deck to have their case. Now, before we get started, the real important thing in regards to this suit is not necessarily who is right or wrong, but that Upper Deck is actually requesting an injunction as well. Basically that the court stops the distribution of Lorcana because that distribution would further damage their ability to profit off of their own product. So if a judge sits down before the release of Lorcana, reads the suit, and determines there are enough similarities and grounds to put that injunction in place, we could see the release of Lorcana being delayed until litigation is put through. So we'll go ahead and jump into the suit. So the product that Upper Deck was working on is their game called Rush of Ichor.
I never heard of him. You never heard of him.
Exactly. As of the filing of this suit, if you didn't work at Upper Deck, you've probably never heard of this game. They've made no announcement of this game or released a launch date for this game. They did, as of April 2023, patent the game Rush of Ichor, which is important to note because that date is the date that the Disney Lorcana rules dropped, was in April of 2023 this year. So a lot of this, when the suit was filed, was based off of when those rules were dropped. So those rules dropped, we don't know the exact timeline obviously, but those rules dropping in April and then going and getting a patent on the product that they thought should be protected and now think that there are similarities between, probably isn't a coincidence. My personal belief is Upper Deck had probably scrapped this project, if not completely, at least mentally in the back of their mind. This project wasn't going to come to light. It had kind of been in limbo since Miller left the project. But with the release of these rules and the similarities that they saw in the rules, I think they wanted to make sure that they had a patent for this product so that they could file this suit accordingly. Now, it's important to know too, if you're reading through the suit, you're going to see the words on information and belief a whole lot. Now, in legalese, this basically means I was told and I believe it to be true. So a lot of what they have is just hearsay. I would imagine with them not filing until the rules were dropped, they don't have a smoking gun. So with that, Upper Deck has to establish that their game is novel, that it is proprietary, and that the two products are so similar that the only way Lorcana comes into existence is by the misuse of the company information that Ryan Miller had access to over at Upper Deck. So they have it lined in their suit. You can read the suit yourself, but it breaks down an overview of both games. And keep in mind, this is written in favor of Upper Deck. It's their attorneys that are writing this up, so they are writing it in the most favorable, most similar way that they can do it. They listed these as remarkable and uncanny similarities and a nearly identical product. So without further ado, I'm going to break down an overview of the Rush of Ichor card game, and I'll give you the comparisons between whether it's a novel, a new concept to card games, or if it's even similar to the style of play in Lorcana, in case you aren't familiar with Lorcana. It actually breaks it down in the following section. If you want to read through the suit, I'll try to link it down below, and you can read through it and see how they even explain the similarities between the two products. So Rush of Ichor is a TCG designed to last approximately an hour. Lorcana, if you've watched any gameplay videos, does not last that long, minus some very odd chains of play. And even within this comparison, when they were talking about Lorcana, they said it's designed to be played within an hour. So even length of play, a much shorter, quicker, faster paced game for Lorcana than Rush of Ichor looked like it was supposed to be. Can be played one-on-one, not novel or new. Obviously, most TCGs are one-on-one or with multiple players per team without major changes to gameplay mechanics. You have multiplayer, again, not a novel concept. Lorcana, not really designed for team play. And their multiplayer aspect has no changes to the gameplay mechanics, where Rush of Ichor at least has some minor changes. So not a lot of similarities there, other than very basic stuff through gameplay. Subject number 2, to play, each player needs cards which are purchased from Upper Deck. Again, not obviously going to be identical in that respect. The player uses purchased cards he or she acquires to strategically build a deck consisting of 40 cards. Not novel, and Lorcana is a 60-card deck. And there can be no more of 3 identical cards in a deck. That may be new to Russia Icar. I don't know very many games that have done 3 identical cards. But again, Lorcana is 4 copies of cards. And the deck can only contain 2 colors of cards. Now, this is similar to Lorcana. You can only use 2 combinations of the colors that are in Lorcana. In Rush of Icar, there are only 4, where Lorcana has 6. That's not a novel concept, but at least the first similarity. Now, I will say, because it does mention it later, but not here, that these colors for Rush of Icar are attached to an avatar that you play as in Rush of Icar, and that mechanic does not exist at all in Lorcana. Lorcana is strictly just limited by a 2-color building while building the deck. It has no relation to it because it doesn't have it. There are also 5 card types. Champions, again, these are creatures from Magic, if you're familiar with it. Not unique, but those are there to attack enemies or engage in raids. Locations, effects put into play and remain until destroyed. There are no locations in Lorcana. Spells, again, not novel. One-time use actions, those are similar to Lorcana actions and songs. Your avatars, which is what we were just talking about. This represents you as the player on the board and determines the 2-color composition of a deck. So similar to like One Piece or the Dragon Ball Super card game, where you have a character in play that is your leader. In this game, it's called your avatar. And then they have overlays, which sounds sort of like creature enchantments from Magic the Gathering, if you're familiar. Again, not novel and not in Lorcana at all. So next article they had here was the cards in Rush of Icar contain abilities, not novel, i.e. keywords, which add certain effects to cards. As example, a card with the ability support, which is not an ability that has at least shown up in Lorcana. Friendly champion with extra strength. A card with the ability elusive, which looks like it functions similar as evasive in Lorcana. And champions with ability formidable, etc. Again, keywords not new, not proprietary, and again, none of these keywords seem to be reused from Lorcana to Rush of Icar. With the deck built and in hand, at the outset of the games, each player or team takes on the role of an avatar or god from ancient cultures such as Greece or Mayan culture. This may be novel and proprietary as far as that theming goes for a TCG, but again, that's not the theming for Lorcana, so it would not be relevant either. To start the game, player draws the top 5 cards from their shuffled deck into their hand. Again, that would not be novel or proprietary, and in Lorcana, you draw 7 cards to start the game. When it's your turn, a player will draw an additional card to their hand, then may draw a card face down to place directly in the influence zone. So, I've played a lot of different card games in my life. This system of putting a resource in play may be novel and proprietary, because I have never heard of putting a resource into play directly from the top of your deck. It sounds terrible. If you're not familiar, Lorcana takes a card from your hand and places it into your inkwell as a resource. Again, that system has been used in some other card games. Dragon Ball Super comes to mind as a card game where you place something from hand. Even Magic the Gathering, while you're not playing any card from your hand, your resource is drawn from your deck and then placed into play. So a lot of similarities with that as far as generating your ink for your inkwell. This is somewhat similar, but this actually is drawing 2 cards a turn, essentially, because you're going to draw 1 card for your hand and then another card into your influence zone. So while they may seem close in that regard, they're really very different ways to generate resource. So this one may be novel and proprietary because I've never seen that way of putting resources into play, but it's, again, not similar to the one that is in Lorcana. The influence zone serves as your resource pool for players. It works just like mana in Magic the Gathering. You put it into play, you exhaust it or use the resource to cast your spells and your stuff. So again, not novel. Magic's been doing it for 30 years. Like, this is pretty standard resource pool mechanics. After drawing a card into the influence zone, the player enters the main phase. Again, the main phase is something as old as Magic the Gathering. During the main phase is when you do stuff. You can attack characters, you can play your action cards, you can summon characters, and then you can, and Rush of Ichor, do what they call raiding, which is similar, and what we're going to talk about here next to the questing for Disney Lorcana. Now, players can send their champions on raids during the main phase. Raids last one turn and is the mechanism by which players earn gems. Rush of Ichors win currency. Champions are assigned a raid value, which is the number of gems the champion will earn if the raid is successful. Now, this mechanic here is probably the only thing that is similar between the two games. Questing and raiding are very similar mechanics, but if they're trying to establish that that is a new or novel idea, that is really not a new or novel idea. It's not even that different from the most fundamental concepts that are out there. For example, in Lorcana, you quest for 20 lore counters, versus in Magic the Gathering, instead of questing, you just attack your opponent for 20 damage. The effect is created the same way. It is slightly more elusive because they can't block the lore generation, where if you're attacking them, they can block it. So there are some subtle differences. At the end of the day, like, it is doing 20 points of something to someone else. With Rush of Ichors win currency, they don't even mention how much you need to earn in the game, and they specifically omit that, I would imagine. So I'm going to guess that their values are dramatically different than Lorcana's lore values. But having a separate stat on the cards to generate the win condition is probably the closest similarity we've had between the two games up until this point. Champions are vulnerable to enemy attacks while they are raiding because they are exhausted. Same as in Lorcana, same as in a lot of other card games. When the cards are exhausted or tapped, they are more vulnerable to attacks. If an attack is performed on a raider, the card's strength values will be compared, where the card with the lowest strength value is destroyed. In the case where they have equal strength, both cards are destroyed. At the core of Rush of Ichor is this mechanic that in order to acquire win currency gems, the player must put their champions in a vulnerable state. So this is different from Lorcana. While characters can attack each other in Lorcana, the strength comparison does not happen. They have a toughness, which apparently they do not have in Rush of Ichor, and a attack value. The attack value stays on the card in Lorcana after the damage is done. In this one, it looks like it just compares, and the highest strength wins. So while they can attack characters similarly, they do not destroy characters similarly. So again, even if they did, this is not something new or proprietary, that could be an intellectual property owned by Upper Deck. They kind of reiterate, unique to Rush of Ichor, the win conditions require players to build themselves up as opposed to predominant TCG win conditions of annihilating your opponent. As mentioned, Rush of Ichor utilizes a win currency called gems. Gems are gained through raiding, and once gained cannot be lost. Players win Rush of Ichor by being the first to gain a set number of gems, which depends on the amount of the individuals playing on each side. So there's a lot here. I am banking that this feature is really what Upper Deck is trying to say is novel and is proprietary and is the reason why they can prove Lorcana is stolen from them. The problem is that it's not novel and it's not proprietary, and they even mention it here when they say that it's predominant to TCG win conditions. Yes, it's predominant that you are attacking or destroying an opponent in TCG, but it is not the only game out there that uses a win condition of building themselves up. You have Keyforge most recently, is one where you're forging keys on your own board to win the game. There are, I think Star Wars Destiny use a similar mechanic to where you're building, your influence, you're building your side of the board to win in that regard rather than by destroying each and every opponent. Now, I like that feature for multiplayer games. I think it helps balance multiplayer games when you're kind of trying to win, not necessarily trying to make your opponent lose. But I don't think that this system is unique enough to be considered novel and therefore not proprietary, which means it wouldn't be protected under intellectual property anyways. And then they even mention in here that that they omit that how many gems you need to win, but the gems fluctuate based on the number of players that are playing the game. Again, something that does not happen in Lorcana. If you have 100 people sitting at a table playing Lorcana, the win condition is still the first person to get to 20 lore. It does not appear that is the case for Rush of Ichor. And then they kind of boil it down to its in essence, which is the most ridiculous part, because this is kind of where their whole case is the Rush of, in essence, the core gameplay loop of Rush of Ichor is to summon champions, engage in raids, mount attacks to stifle enemy raids, and retrieve gems. Later on, they go to break down Lorcana, basically saying it's summoning characters, engaging in quests, mounting attacks to stifle enemy quests, and receiving lore. And I'll boil them down to those four things, and they are identical. But that also summarizes most games that are out there. I mean, you can apply it to just about any game that you have out there. So yeah, there you have it. I don't know that I consider these games to be overly similar, at least not any more so than any other TCG that's out on the market. I certainly would not consider them to be identical. I don't believe that the Upper Deck really has a case that anything that they've really illustrated in their game is novel or proprietary. So I think they're going to have a hard time getting any of this to stand. I think their biggest play here is just due to the short window that Ravensburger is working with. If they can get a judge to issue an injunction before the release date, I think that Ravensburger will want to settle for an undisclosed amount just to make sure that their product launches on time. And I think that's really the only play Upper Deck has here. I don't think it is a good look for Upper Deck by any stretch of the imagination. It definitely feels like they may have had their feelings hurt by Ryan Miller leaving the company and going somewhere else and getting a product out faster at that other company than he was able to do for them. I don't know why Ryan left. Ryan may have left because they were dragging their feet on the development of pushing this game out. It could be a number of things. But personally, I don't think it's a very strong suit. I don't think anything long-term is going to happen with Lorcana. But feel free to let me know in the comment section below if you disagree or if you have any other insights into this issue. Till next time, Hobby Hero, out.